You don't belong in first class, sweetie. Christmas charity doesn't extend to fake tickets. The words sliced through the holiday cheer like a blade through wrapping paper. Sandra Martinez, lead flight attendant of Coastal Airlines Flight 447, didn't whisper it. She announced it loud enough for every passenger sipping champagne to hear. What Sandra didn't know was that the black teenager in the oversized Christmas hoodie standing in front of her was about to cost her everything. And in exactly 14 minutes, when that private jet touched down on the tarmac in London, the girl's father would shut down her entire career with a single phone call. Christmas Eve, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm amber glow, casting long shadows across the luxury interior of Flight 447. Outside the windows, stars twinkled like diamonds against the infinite black canvas of the night sky. Inside, the atmosphere should have been magical, should have been filled with the excitement of families heading to London for Christmas morning, should have been peaceful. Instead, it was about to become a nightmare. The girl in the red Christmas hoodie stood perfectly still in the first-class aisle, her hands at her sides, her breathing controlled despite the public humiliation. Her name was Amara Johnson, though Sandra Martinez didn't bother to ask. To Sandra, she was just another problem to be solved, another disruption to be removed, another black face that didn't belong in her pristine first-class cabin. What Sandra couldn't see, what her prejudice blinded her to, was the quiet strength in Amara's dark eyes. The same eyes that had watched her father build a shipping empire from nothing. The same eyes that had learned to stay calm when adults showed their true colors. The same eyes that would soon watch Sandra's world crumble around her. Ma'am, Amara said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is my seat. I have my boarding pass right here. Sandra's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. It was the kind of smile predators wore before they struck. Around them, other passengers pretended not to stare while hanging on every word. Some pulled out their phones discreetly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats. A few nodded approvingly at Sandra's aggressive stance. The countdown had begun, though nobody knew it yet. 14 minutes until landing. 14 minutes until David Johnson's private jet would touch down and change everything. 14 minutes until the most powerful shipping magnate in the Western Hemisphere would discover that his daughter had been treated like a criminal at 30,000 feet. Sandra leaned forward close enough that Amara could smell her coffee breath. Listen carefully, little girl. I've been flying these routes for 15 years. I know exactly what I'm looking at. The cabin fell silent. Even the soft Christmas music playing through the speakers seemed to pause, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any accusation. 17-year-old Amara Johnson had learned early that the world would judge her before she spoke a single word. Standing 5 feet 6 inches with intelligent brown eyes and natural hair pulled back in neat braids, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from being raised by a father who had built an empire from scratch. The oversized red Christmas hoodie she wore was a deliberate choice. Comfortable for the long flight, festive for the holiday, and unfortunately the perfect target for people like Sandra Martinez. Amara's journey to this moment began 12 hours earlier in her father's penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. She had been packing for what was supposed to be a surprise Christmas reunion in London. David Johnson. Her father had been in Europe for 3 months, finalizing the acquisition of the largest shipping company in Northern Europe. It would make Johnson Global Logistics the undisputed leader in international freight, worth an estimated $12 billion. But Amara didn't think about her father's wealth as she packed her simple clothes into a designer backpack she'd owned for years. She thought about surprising him on Christmas morning, about seeing his face when she knocked on his hotel room door, about finally having a normal Christmas together after years of business trips and boardroom meetings. The gray sweatpants she wore were soft and broken and perfect for a transatlantic flight. Her sneakers looked scuffed and ordinary to anyone who didn't recognize the limited edition design that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She preferred it this way, flying under the radar, blending in, not drawing attention to the fact that her father could buy and sell most of the people around her. Sandra Martinez saw none of this context. She saw only surface details filtered through 15 years of prejudice and resentment. 38 years old with bleached blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, Sandra had worked for Coastal Airlines since she was 23. She had started as a domestic flight attendant, worked her way up to international routes, and recently been demoted back to domestic after a series of passenger complaints. The complaints weren't about her service. They were about her attitude, her tendency to assume the worst about certain passengers, her habit of making people feel unwelcome based on how they looked rather than how they behaved. Management had given her a final warning 6 months ago. Work the international Christmas routes without incident, they said, or find another job. Sandra's marriage had ended 2 years earlier. Her ex-husband, Miguel Martinez, had tired of her constant negativity and casual racism. He had taken their 2 children and moved to Phoenix, leaving Sandra alone in a cramped apartment in Queens with nothing but her job and her bitterness. She saw threats everywhere now. Scammers trying to steal first-class seats, troublemakers trying to get free upgrades, young people trying to make her look foolish on social media. Officer Blake Thompson represented a different kind of danger entirely. 45 years old, with steel-gray hair and shoulders that stretched his federal air marshal uniform, Thompson had spent 22 years in the military before joining the Transportation Security Administration. He believed in order. He believed in authority. Most dangerously, he believed that questioning authority was a sign of guilt. Thompson's backstory was written in the scars on his knuckles and the rigid way he held his spine. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that hesitation could be fatal, that threats needed to be neutralized quickly and decisively, that civilians didn't understand the realities of security in a dangerous world. What Thompson had never learned was how to tell the difference between a real threat and a teenage girl trying to get to her seat. The supporting cast filled the first-class cabin like pieces on a chessboard, each with their own motivations and prejudices. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a 52-year-old cardiologist traveling to London for a medical conference, sat in seat 1A, reading a journal article about pediatric heart surgery. His own daughter was Amara's age, studying pre-med at Columbia. He would later say that he saw the resemblance immediately, but convinced himself it wasn't his problem, Mrs. Elizabeth Cooper, 68 years old, with pearls that cost more than most cars, occupied seat 3B with the entitled air of someone who had never been questioned about anything in her life. She had inherited her wealth rather than earned it, which made her suspicious of anyone who looked like they might be trying to claim something they hadn't been born into. James Wilson, 34 and traveling for business, held his phone discreetly in seat 4C. A social media manager for a tech company, he recognized content when he saw it. His finger hovered over the record button, knowing that whatever was about to happen would either go viral or get him sued. None of them knew they were about to witness the beginning of the end for Sandra Martinez and Blake Thompson. None of them knew that the quiet teenager in the Christmas hoodie was exactly 14 minutes away from changing all their lives forever. December 23rd, 11:47 p.m. local time. Coastal Airlines Flight 447 cruised at 37,000 feet above the dark Atlantic, its twin engines humming a steady rhythm that had lulled half the economy passengers to sleep hours ago. In first class, however, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipatory energy. Christmas Eve was less than 13 minutes away, and London beckoned with promises of Boxing Day shopping, West End shows, and holiday magic. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of Coastal's newest additions to their transatlantic fleet. The first-class cabin featured 12 seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each offering direct aisle access and enough privacy for passengers to conduct business or sleep without interruption. The leather seats cost more than many people's annual salaries and reclined into fully flat beds with Egyptian cotton linens. Soft lighting mimicked the progression of a natural day currently dimmed to encourage rest during the overnight flight. The cabin's temperature was kept at a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to be comfortable but warm enough to prevent complaints. Hidden speakers played a carefully curated playlist of holiday classics performed by the London Symphony Orchestra, the volume low enough to be ambient but clear enough to remind everyone of the approaching celebration. The galley areas at the front and rear of the first-class section gleamed with polished steel and warm wood accents. Crystal glassware caught the light as flight attendants prepared for the pre-landing service. Bottles of champagne chilled in ice buckets, their labels facing outward to display the premium brands that justified the four-figure ticket prices. Outside the oval windows, the night sky stretched endlessly in all directions. No cities below, no ships on the ocean's surface, just the vast darkness that made air travel feel like temporary suspension between worlds. The stars above seemed close enough to touch their light refracted through the double-paned glass to create tiny rainbows that danced across the cabin walls. It was the kind of setting that usually brought out the best in people. The magic of flight. The anticipation of Christmas morning, the shared experience of crossing an ocean together toward new adventures. Children on their first international flights pressed their faces against windows in wonder. Adults smiled at strangers and shared stories of holiday plans. Even the most jaded business travelers found themselves softened by the approaching celebration. But magic requires belief, and some hearts are too hardened by prejudice to let wonder take root. For Sandra Martinez, the beautiful cabin was just another workplace filled with potential problems. The expensive furnishings were things to be protected from passengers who might not deserve them. The holiday music was background noise to be ignored while she focused on maintaining control over her domain. The passenger manifest told its own story of Christmas travel dreams. Families reuniting after months apart, couples taking romantic getaways to Europe, business leaders escaping the pressure of year-end deadlines for a few days of rest, artists and performers heading to London's theater district for holiday productions. Each name represented hopes and expectations for the Christmas season. Amara Johnson's name appeared on that manifest as a standard first-class passenger. Her ticket had been purchased 3 weeks earlier by Johnson Global Logistics Corporate Travel Department, the same operation that booked hundreds of flights annually for company executives. The payment came from a corporate American Express black card that had never been declined, never been questioned, never been associated with any kind of fraud or suspicious activity. But manifests are just names and seat numbers. They don't capture the humanity of the people they represent. They don't show the excitement of a daughter planning to surprise her father on Christmas morning. They don't reveal the love that motivated a 17-year-old to spend her winter break crossing the Atlantic alone just to share a holiday meal. In the cargo hold below Christmas presents wrapped in gold and silver paper shared space with business documents and traveler's luggage. Among them, a small wrapped box containing a vintage compass that Amara had found in an antique shop in Greenwich Village. She had spent 3 weeks searching for the perfect gift for a man who seemed to have everything. The compass was special not because of its monetary value, but because it bore an inscription that read, "True Direction." She thought her father would appreciate both the nautical connection to his shipping business and the deeper meaning about staying true to one's moral compass. The irony was not lost that while this thoughtful gift flew in the darkness below its giver, was about to become the victim of people who had lost their own moral direction entirely. Flight 447 was exactly 13 minutes away from beginning its descent into Dublin for an unscheduled emergency landing. The crew didn't know it yet. The passengers drinking champagne and discussing Christmas plans didn't know it. Even David Johnson, working late in his London hotel suite while monitoring his daughter's flight progress, didn't know it. But time was running out for Sandra Martinez and Blake Thompson to recognize their mistake. The holiday magic that surrounded them was about to turn into something much darker. The Christmas spirit that should have made them more compassionate was about to be overshadowed by prejudice violence, and the kind of injustice that destroys careers and changes lives forever. In the distance, unseen but approaching rapidly, David Johnson's private jet had just taken off from London City Airport. The boarding process at JFK had been smooth for Amara, almost deceptively normal. She had arrived at the gate 30 minutes before departure, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs to wait for the boarding announcement. Around her, the usual chaos of Christmas Eve travel played out in familiar patterns. Families juggled multiple carry-ons and restless children. Business travelers typed urgently on laptops, racing against deadlines. Holiday travelers wore festive sweaters and Santa hats, their excitement palpable. When the gate agent announced first-class boarding, Amara had waited for the initial rush to subside. She preferred to board last among the priority passengers, avoiding the competitive energy that seemed to possess people when they saw others enjoying privileges they couldn't afford. It was a lesson her father had taught her early: when you have advantages, use them quietly and gratefully. The gate agent, a professional man in his 40s named Gary Mitchell, had scanned Amara's phone without hesitation. The machine beeped green, immediately displaying her seat assignment and passenger details. Gary had glanced at the screen, then at Amara, then smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had checked thousands of passengers onto flights over his 15-year career. "First time to London?" Miss Johnson, he had asked, making conversation while printing her boarding passes. "No, sir." "But first time surprising my dad there." Amara had replied, her excitement evident despite her attempt to stay composed. Gary had handed her the papers with a genuine smile. "Well, have a wonderful Christmas reunion. Safe travels." If only he had known that his cheerful well wishes were the last kindness Amara would receive for the next several hours. Walking down the jet bridge, Amara had felt the familiar excitement of international travel. The enclosed walkway connecting the gate to the aircraft always felt like a portal between worlds, a transition space where ordinary rules temporarily didn't apply. At the end of the bridge, the aircraft door opened into first class, revealing the luxury cabin that represented not just comfort, but possibility. She turned left upon boarding, as first-class passengers always did. The cabin was perhaps half full, with other passengers still settling in and stowing their carry-ons. The atmosphere was relaxed and festive, with soft jazz playing and flight attendants offering champagne and warm towels. It should have been perfect. Sandra Martinez stood at the front galley supervising the pre-departure service with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. She wore the standard Coastal Airlines uniform, a navy blue blazer with gold buttons, a crisp white blouse, and a silk scarf tied in the company's signature pattern. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, every strand in place, her makeup applied with military precision. She looked professional and competent, the kind of employee passengers would trust to handle emergencies. But appearances, as Amara was about to learn, could be deadly deceiving. "Good evening," Dr. Rodriguez Sandra said warmly to the cardiologist settling into seat 1A. "Welcome aboard. Can I take your jacket champagne before takeoff?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled and handed over his coat, accepting the champagne with thanks. Sandra's demeanor was perfect, attentive, respectful, professional, the kind of service that justified first-class prices. "Mr. and Mrs. Cooper," she continued, turning to the elderly couple in seats 3A and 3B, "so wonderful to have you with us again. I have your usual preference for sparkling water noted in my account." Mrs. Cooper beamed at the recognition. "Thank you, dear. You always take such good care of us." Sandra's smile was genuine as she served these passengers. They fit her mental image of who belonged in first class, well-dressed, clearly affluent, predominantly white. They confirmed her worldview that certain types of people belonged in certain places. Amara approached row 2, where her seat 2A waited by the window. She had specifically requested a window seat for the sunrise arrival in London, hoping to get photos of the English countryside to share with her father. The seat looked inviting with its white leather upholstery and personal entertainment screen displaying a welcome message. "Whoa, hold on there." Sandra's voice cut through the cabin ambiance like a knife through silk. The warmth that had characterized her interactions with other passengers vanished instantly, replaced by suspicion and hostility. She stepped into the aisle, physically blocking Amara's path to her seat. Conversations stopped. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from his medical journal. The Coopers paused their discussion about London theater tickets. James Wilson, the business traveler, instinctively reached for his phone. "I'm sorry," Sandra said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But you're going the wrong way, sweetheart. Economy class is toward the back of the aircraft." The words hung in the air like a slap. Amara felt her cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from the familiar sting of being judged solely on her appearance. She had experienced this before at restaurants, hotels, even department stores, but never at 37,000 feet with nowhere to escape. "I'm in seat 2A," Amara replied quietly, maintaining her composure despite the public nature of the confrontation. She had learned from her father's example that dignity was more powerful than anger, that responding to prejudice with grace often exposed the accuser's ignorance more effectively than fighting back. Sandra let out a laugh that held no humor. It was the sound of someone who believed they held all the power in a situation and intended to use it. She looked Amara up and down with undisguised disdain, taking in the Christmas hoodie, the sweatpants, the young blackface that didn't match her expectations for first-class passengers. "Let's not play games today, honey," Sandra said, her voice carrying the condescension of someone speaking to a child they considered both foolish and deceptive. "We have a full flight, and I don't have time for social media pranks or whatever this is supposed to be. I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." The assumption stung. That this was a prank. That Amara was some kind of scammer or attention seeker trying to steal a seat she couldn't afford. That a black teenager in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong in first class through any legitimate means. Around them, the other passengers watched with the uncomfortable fascination people display when witnessing public humiliation that doesn't directly affect them. Some looked sympathetic, but remained silent. Others nodded approvingly at Sandra's aggressive stance, satisfied to see someone they perceived as an intruder being handled firmly. Amara unlocked her phone with steady hands and displayed her boarding pass on the screen. The digital ticket clearly showed her name seat assignment and flight details. Coastal Airlines' app interface was familiar and professional, impossible to fake convincingly. But Sandra wasn't interested in evidence that contradicted her assumptions. Instead of examining the boarding pass carefully, she snatched the phone from Amara's hands with a roughness that spoke to her growing irritation at having her authority questioned. "This could be anything," Sandra declared, studying the screen with theatrical skepticism. "Screenshots, photo editing. There are apps that can fake boarding passes. I've seen it all before. Nice try, but you're not fooling anyone." The accusation escalated the situation beyond mere misunderstanding into active hostility. Sandra wasn't just questioning Amara's right to be in first class. She was accusing her of criminal fraud, in front of witnesses, with cameras potentially recording. "It's not fake," Amara said, reaching for her phone. "If you give it back, I can refresh the app and show you." "Don't grab at me." Sandra recoiled dramatically, clutching the phone to her chest as if protecting evidence of a crime. "I'm going to verify this with the gate agent. You stand right here and don't you dare sit down until this gets sorted out." The public nature of the humiliation was clearly intentional. Sandra wanted the other passengers to see her taking charge, handling a potential security threat with firm authority. She wanted them to feel safe, knowing she was protecting their expensive seats from unauthorized intruders. But what Sandra had actually done was steal a passenger's personal property and publicly accuse them of fraud without any evidence beyond her own prejudice. She had turned a routine boarding process into a discriminatory incident that was about to spiral completely out of control. In her pocket, Amara's smartwatch buzzed with a notification from her father's assistant. The message was routine flight tracker shows on-time departure. See you tomorrow for Christmas surprise, safe travels. If Monica Williams had known what was happening aboard Flight 447, David Johnson's private jet would have been airborne within minutes. But for now, the most powerful shipping executive in the Western Hemisphere continued working late in his London hotel suite, trusting that his daughter was safely settled in first class, perhaps already asleep over the Atlantic. Trust, it turned out, was about to become a very expensive mistake. The transformation in cabin atmosphere was immediate and uncomfortable. What had been a relaxed pre-flight environment filled with holiday cheer became a tense theater of conflict, with Amara unwillingly cast as the central performer in Sandra's power play. The soft jazz music continued playing through hidden speakers, but now it seemed inappropriate, almost mocking against the backdrop of public humiliation. Sandra moved with the confidence of someone who believed she was handling a routine security threat. She walked to the front galley with Amara's phone clutched possessively in her hand, her heels clicking against the cabin floor with sharp precision. The sound seemed amplified in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the first-class section. Maria Sandra called to her colleague, a younger flight attendant who had been quietly preparing the beverage service. "I need you to witness this situation. We may have a fraudulent boarding pass issue in seat 2A. Maria Santos, 28 years old and relatively new to international routes, looked uncomfortable with being drawn into the confrontation. She had noticed Amara board normally and assumed everything was routine. But Sandra was her supervisor, someone with 15 years of experience who presumably knew how to spot problems that escaped newer employees. "Should I call the captain?" Maria asked quietly, hoping to keep the situation from escalating further. "Not yet," Sandra replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who enjoyed being in control. "Let me verify a few things first, but stay close in case we need backup." Sandra picked up the interphone that connected the cabin to the cockpit and gate operations. Her movements were deliberate and theatrical, designed to be seen by the passengers who were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Sandra in the forward cabin. We have a potential security issue that may require gate verification. A passenger is presenting questionable documentation for seat 2A. The captain's voice crackled through the handset, professional but concerned. "Understood, Sandra. What's the nature of the problem?" "Possible fraudulent boarding pass, sir. Young female passenger doesn't match the typical profile for our first-class service. I'm seeing red flags that suggest this might be an attempted scam." Captain Rodriguez, a 30-year veteran with Coastal Airlines, trusted his senior flight attendants to handle cabin security issues. Sandra had a reputation for being thorough, perhaps overly so, but he had never known her to raise concerns without cause. "Roger that. Do what you need to do to verify. We're still 20 minutes from pushback, so we have time to sort this out properly." The public nature of the phone call was intentional. Sandra wanted the other passengers to hear her professional handling of what she presented as a security threat. She wanted them to feel confident that their safety and comfort were her top priorities. Dr. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, finally looking up from his medical journal to observe the situation directly. Something felt wrong to him, not about Amara's presence, but about Sandra's aggressive approach. In his medical training, he had learned to gather evidence before making diagnoses. Sandra seemed to be doing the opposite, reaching conclusions first, and seeking evidence to support them afterward. Mrs. Cooper, however, nodded approvingly at Sandra's decisive action. In her worldview, certain types of people belonged in certain places, and challenges to that order needed to be met with firm resistance. She had no sympathy for young people who tried to claim privileges they hadn't earned through proper channels. James Wilson continued to hold his phone discreetly, his finger hovering over the record button. His social media instincts told him that whatever was happening had the potential to go viral, but his business sense warned him that recording without consent could create legal problems. For now, he waited and watched. Meanwhile, Amara stood in the aisle where Sandra had commanded her to wait, feeling the eyes of strangers judging her worth as a human being. The humiliation was familiar, but never easier to endure. She had experienced versions of this scenario throughout her life, being followed in department stores, questioned at hotels, challenged at restaurants, but never with such a captive audience and never with such high stakes. Her father had taught her to respond to prejudice with dignity rather than anger. When people show you their character, he often said, believe them the first time. But don't let their character diminish yours. The advice had served her well in previous encounters, but this situation felt different, more public, more dangerous. Sandra returned from the galley with Amara's phone still in her possession, her expression set in the satisfied look of someone who believed she was solving a problem rather than creating one. "I've spoken with the captain," she announced, speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "He's authorized me to verify your documentation before we proceed. This is standard protocol for questionable boarding passes." The word questionable hung in the air like an accusation. Sandra made it sound like Amara was already guilty of something, that the verification process was just a formality before confirmation of wrongdoing. "Ma'am," Amara said quietly, maintaining her composure despite the growing stress of the situation. "If you'll just check your passenger manifest, you'll see that my name is listed for seat 2A. Amara Johnson. The ticket was purchased 3 weeks ago through Johnson Global Logistics." The mention of her father's company should have been enough to end the confrontation immediately. Johnson Global Logistics was one of Coastal Airline's corporate clients, booking hundreds of flights annually for company executives and their families. Any experienced flight attendant should have recognized the name and realized their mistake. But Sandra was too invested in her narrative to consider evidence that contradicted it. She had already decided that Amara was a scammer, and confirmation bias prevented her from processing information that challenged that assumption. "Anyone can make up company names," Sandra replied dismissively. "I've seen passengers claim to work for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, even the royal family. Usually it's young people looking for social media content or trying to impress their friends." The casual racism in her response was unmistakable. The assumption that a black teenager couldn't legitimately have connections to corporate executives. The belief that claims of affluence from someone who looked like Amara must be fabricated for attention. Dr. Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to in crisis situations. "Ma'am, perhaps we could simply check the passenger manifest to resolve this quickly. I'm sure it would only take a moment." Sandra turned to face him with barely concealed irritation at having her authority questioned by a passenger, even one traveling in first class. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I'm following proper security protocols. This situation requires thorough verification." "It requires common sense," Dr. Rodriguez replied firmly. "This young lady boarded. Normally, she has documentation and she's asking for nothing more than access to her assigned seat. Perhaps we're making this more complicated than necessary." The support from an older, respected passenger should have given Sandra pause to reconsider her approach. Instead, it made her more defensive and determined to prove she was right. In her mind, the passengers were ganging up against her authority, making it even more important to assert control over the situation. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Sandra said, her voice rising slightly with frustration. "I know how to spot problems that others might miss. This passenger is presenting red flags that can't be ignored simply because she seems polite." The phrase "seems polite" carried unmistakable implications. That Amara's calm demeanor was somehow deceptive. That politeness from someone who looked like her was suspicious rather than admirable. That her very composure was evidence of guilt rather than innocence. Around the cabin, passengers were beginning to choose sides. Some supported Sandra's authoritative handling of what she presented as a security issue. Others felt uncomfortable with the aggressive treatment of a teenager who appeared to be doing nothing wrong. The Christmas spirit that should have made everyone more charitable was being overshadowed by prejudice and fear. Time was running out for cooler heads to prevail. Sandra had committed herself to a course of action that could only end in one of two ways: vindication through proof of Amara's guilt, or humiliation through exposure of her own prejudice. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Sandra was too invested in being right to consider the possibility that she might be catastrophically wrong. In London, David Johnson checked his watch and smiled, thinking about surprising his daughter at breakfast in just a few hours. He had no idea that those hours would instead be spent in hospital waiting rooms, courtrooms, and meetings with lawyers who specialized in civil rights violations. The moment Officer Blake Thompson stepped into the first-class cabin, the entire atmosphere shifted from uncomfortable tension to genuine danger. His presence brought with it the weight of federal authority and the implicit threat of force that changed every calculation in the equation Sandra had been building. Thompson was not a large man in terms of height, standing perhaps 5 feet 10 inches, but he carried himself with the compact strength of someone who had spent decades in situations where physical confrontation was always a possibility. His federal air marshal credentials gave him authority that superseded even the captains in matters of aircraft security, and his military background had trained him to make quick decisions based on limited information. "Is there a problem here?" Thompson's voice cut through the cabin noise with the sharp edge of authority. He didn't ask the question with curiosity or concern. He asked it with the expectation that problems would be identified, assessed, and eliminated efficiently. Sandra felt a surge of relief at seeing backup arrive. Thompson represented validation of her approach and the muscle to enforce whatever resolution she deemed necessary. She had called for security assistance through proper channels, and the response proved she was handling a legitimate threat. "Officer Thompson." Sandra said, her voice carrying the practiced deference of someone speaking to law enforcement while maintaining her own authority over the situation. "This passenger is presenting fraudulent documentation and refusing to move to her assigned section. She's been disruptive and uncooperative since boarding." The characterization was a masterwork of selective reporting that transformed Amara's calm request to reach her seat into defiance and her polite explanations into disruption. Sandra had reconstructed the narrative to cast herself as the responsible authority figure dealing with an unruly passenger who posed a security risk. Thompson's eyes swept over Amara with the clinical assessment of someone trained to identify threats quickly. He saw a black teenager in casual clothing standing in a luxury cabin where she appeared not to belong. His experience in military and federal service had conditioned him to trust the judgment of flight crew members who worked these routes regularly and knew how to spot problems. "Ma'am," Thompson said, addressing Amara with the kind of false politeness that carried an underlying threat, "I'm going to need you to cooperate fully with the flight crew's instructions. Do you have legitimate documentation for this seat assignment?" The question itself revealed Thompson's bias. Rather than asking Sandra to prove her accusations or examining the evidence objectively, he began from the assumption that Amara was guilty until proven innocent. The burden of proof had been reversed, placing a teenager in the position of having to defend her right to exist in a space she had paid to occupy. "Yes, sir," Amara replied, maintaining her composure despite the escalating seriousness of the situation. "My boarding pass is right there." She gestured towards Sandra, who still clutched Amara's phone like evidence in a criminal case. "She claims it's a legitimate boarding pass," Sandra interjected quickly, "but I've seen sophisticated fakes before. Young people today are very skilled with technology. They think they can outsmart the operation." Thompson nodded, as if Sandra's explanation confirmed suspicions he had already formed. In his worldview, security threats often came disguised as innocuous situations that required careful investigation. The fact that Amara appeared calm and polite didn't diminish the potential threat. It might actually enhance it by suggesting premeditation and sophisticated planning. Dr. Rodriguez made one final attempt to inject reason into the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Officer, perhaps we could simply verify the passenger manifest. It would take less than a minute to confirm whether this young lady is legitimately assigned to seat 2A. Thompson's response revealed the fundamental flaw in his approach to security. Rather than welcoming the suggestion of additional verification, he interpreted it as interference with his authority and judgment. "Sir, I appreciate your input, but I'm trained to assess these situations. The flight crew has raised legitimate concerns that need to be addressed through proper protocols." The phrase "proper protocols" would later be examined extensively in legal proceedings, because what Thompson considered proper was actually a violation of multiple federal regulations regarding passenger rights and due process. But in the moment, his authority seemed absolute and unquestionable. "Ma'am," Thompson said, turning back to Amara with an expression that had hardened into official resolve, "I'm going to need you to gather any personal belongings and come with me. We'll sort this out at the gate." The command represented a point of no return. Thompson was not requesting compliance, he was ordering it. And federal air marshals have the legal authority to remove passengers from aircraft for security reasons, even when those reasons are later determined to be unfounded. Amara felt the situation spinning beyond her control, transforming from embarrassing misunderstanding to serious legal jeopardy. She had done nothing wrong, committed no crime, violated no regulations. But she was about to be forcibly removed from a flight she had legitimately boarded in front of witnesses under suspicion of fraud she hadn't committed. "Sir, I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice still calm but carrying a note of desperation that reflected her growing understanding of how badly this situation was deteriorating. "Please just check the manifest. Call Johnson Global Logistics. My father is David Johnson." The mention of her father's name should have stopped everything immediately. David Johnson was not just wealthy, he was famous within transportation and logistics circles. His company was regularly featured in business publications, and his acquisition deals made headlines in financial news. Any experienced airline employee should have recognized the name. But Thompson, like Sandra before him, was too committed to his initial assessment to process information that contradicted it. In his experience, people who claimed powerful connections were usually lying, and the more desperate they became, the more elaborate their stories grew. "Ma'am, you need to come with me right now. Any further resistance will be treated as interference with a federal officer." The threat was clear and absolute. Comply or face criminal charges in addition to removal from the flight. For a 17-year-old girl who had done nothing more than try to reach her assigned seat, the choice seemed impossible. But sometimes impossible choices lead to unimaginable consequences. The transformation from verbal confrontation to physical violence happened with the sudden brutality that characterizes most real-world conflicts. There was no dramatic buildup, no extended negotiation, no opportunity for cooler heads to prevail. One moment, Amara was standing in the aisle trying to explain her legitimate right to be there. The next, she was fighting for her basic dignity and physical safety. "I'm not resisting," Amara said, her voice carrying a tremor that reflected her growing fear of how rapidly the situation was escalating beyond reason. "I just want to show you that my ticket is real. Please just check your arrangement." Thompson had already decided that Amara's continued presence in first class represented a security threat that needed immediate resolution. In his training, both military and federal, he had learned that hesitation in the face of potential threats could lead to catastrophic consequences. Better to act decisively and sort out details later than to allow situations to deteriorate beyond control. "Ma'am, you have 3 seconds to start moving toward the exit or I'm going to assist you," Thompson said, his hand moving instinctively toward the restraints on his belt. The gesture was automatic, conditioned by years of training that emphasized physical control over verbal negotiation. The 3-second ultimatum revealed everything wrong with Thompson's approach to the situation. He had made no effort to verify Sandra's accusations independently. He had not examined Amara's documentation. He had not checked the passenger manifest or contacted the airline's customer service. He had simply accepted the word of a flight attendant who had already demonstrated clear bias and was now demanding compliance through threat of force. "Sir, please, doctor," Rodriguez interjected one final time, his medical training making him sensitive to the stress indicators he could see building in everyone involved. "This is escalating unnecessarily. Can't we simply—" "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay in your seat and let me handle this." Thompson cut him off with the sharp authority of someone who brooked no interference with his decisions. "This is a federal security matter." The phrase federal security matter transformed what should have been a customer service issue into something that sounded like national security. Thompson had elevated a seating dispute into a crisis that justified extreme measures even though no actual threat existed beyond Sandra's prejudice and his own poor judgment. Amara looked around the cabin, desperately hoping that someone with common sense would step forward to stop what was clearly becoming an abuse of authority. But the other passengers seemed frozen between their discomfort with what they were witnessing and their reluctance to interfere with federal law enforcement. Mrs. Cooper actually nodded approvingly at Thompson's firm handling of what she perceived as a security threat. In her worldview, young people who challenged authority needed to be taught respect through decisive action. The fact that Amara had remained polite and calm throughout the confrontation didn't register as evidence of innocence. It registered as evidence of cunning. James Wilson finally made his decision about recording, pulling out his phone and starting to capture video discreetly. His instincts told him that whatever happened next would be significant enough to justify the legal risks of recording without consent. He positioned the phone to capture the scene while appearing to simply check messages. "Time's up," Thompson announced, reaching for Amara's arm with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar actions countless times in his military and federal career. "Let's go." The moment his hand made contact with Amara's arm, everything changed irrevocably. What had been a civil dispute became a physical confrontation with a federal officer. What had been a customer service issue became a criminal justice matter. What had been a misunderstanding became a civil rights violation that would eventually cost careers, trigger federal investigations, and destroy lives. Amara's instinctive response was to pull away from Thompson's grip, not out of defiance, but from the natural human reaction to unwanted physical contact. She had been raised by parents who taught her that her body belonged to her, that she had the right to refuse unwanted touching, that physical space was a boundary that should be respected. But Thompson interpreted her withdrawal as resistance to federal authority, which transformed her from a passenger disputing a seating assignment to a criminal suspect actively defying law enforcement. In his training and experience, resistance needed to be overcome immediately and decisively to prevent escalation into more serious threats. "She's resisting." Sandra called out, her voice carrying satisfaction at seeing her judgment validated by Amara's apparent defiance. "I told you she was going to be a problem." The declaration became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By labeling Amara's natural response as resistance, Sandra provided Thompson with the justification he needed to escalate his use of force. The situation had moved beyond customer service into law enforcement, where different rules applied and physical control took precedence over verbal resolution. Thompson's military training kicked in with automatic efficiency. He swept Amara's legs while maintaining his grip on her arm, a textbook maneuver designed to bring suspects under control quickly and decisively. The technique was appropriate for armed combatants or dangerous criminals. It was catastrophically inappropriate for a 17-year-old girl disputing a seating assignment. Amara hit the carpeted floor of the first-class aisle with a heavy impact that knocked the breath from her lungs and sent a shock of pain through her hip and shoulder. The sound of her body hitting the ground was dull and final, like a door slamming shut on any possibility of peaceful resolution. "Stop!" Dr. Rodriguez called out, his medical instincts overriding his reluctance to interfere with federal authority. "She's just a child." But Thompson was already moving to the next phase of his restraint protocol. He dropped to one knee, pressing it into the small of Amara's back, while pulling her arms behind her with enough force to make her shoulders scream in protest. The handcuffs came out with the metallic efficiency of tools that had been used too many times in similar situations. "I can't breathe." Amara gasped her words, muffled by the carpet and distorted by the weight pressing down on her lungs. "Please, you're hurting me." The plea should have stopped everything immediately. Federal regulations required officers to respond to claims of breathing difficulty with immediate medical assessment. But Thompson had committed to a course of action that seemed to require completion regardless of new information or changing circumstances. The handcuffs clicked shut with mechanical precision, ratcheting tight against Amara's wrists with enough pressure to immediately restrict blood flow. Thompson had not adjusted them for her smaller frame, and the standard restraints designed for adult male suspects bit deep into her skin, leaving marks that would be visible for weeks afterward. "Stop resisting, and this will be over quickly," Thompson announced for the benefit of the watching passengers, though Amara had stopped moving entirely beneath his weight. The phrase was part of his trained script for subduing suspects, but it created a false narrative about her behavior that would be repeated in incident reports and legal documents. Sandra watched the physical restraint with vindicated satisfaction. In her mind, Amara's violent removal proved that her initial suspicions had been correct. The teenager's calm demeanor and polite requests had been deceptive, masking the kind of person who would physically resist federal authority when challenged. "Get her out of here," Mrs. Cooper called out from her seat, her voice carrying the imperious tone of someone accustomed to having unpleasant situations resolved quickly and efficiently. "We have Christmas plans to keep." The casual dismissal of Amara's obvious distress revealed the depth of dehumanization that had occurred during the confrontation. She had been transformed from a fellow passenger with rights and dignity into an obstacle to be removed so that others could continue their holiday travel without further inconvenience. Dr. Rodriguez stood up from his seat, his medical oath compelling him to intervene despite the potential consequences. "Officer, she's having difficulty breathing. I'm a physician, and I need to examine her immediately." Thompson looked up from his position kneeling on Amara's back. His face flushed with exertion and his breathing elevated from the physical confrontation. "Sir, I'm going to need you to sit down. This suspect is under federal custody and I can't allow civilian interference." The word suspect completed Amara's transformation from passenger to criminal in the official narrative. She was no longer someone disputing a seating assignment. She was someone who had committed a crime serious enough to justify federal intervention and physical restraint. "She's not a suspect. She's a patient," Dr. Rodriguez replied with growing urgency. "Look at her color. Listen to her breathing. She needs immediate medical attention." But Thompson had been trained to view challenges to his authority as potential security threats that needed to be neutralized. Dr. Rodriguez's insistence on examining Amara registered not as medical necessity, but as interference with federal law enforcement that could escalate into a broader security situation. Maria Santos, the junior flight attendant who had been watching the confrontation with growing horror, finally spoke up, despite her fear of contradicting her supervisor. "Sandra, maybe we should check the manifest like the doctor suggested. This seems like it's getting out of hand." Sandra whirled on her colleague with fury that had been building throughout the confrontation. "Maria, you need to support the crew or find another job. I'm handling a security threat according to proper protocols." The threat to Maria's employment silenced what might have been the last voice of reason in the first-class cabin. With Dr. Rodriguez restrained by Thompson's authority and Maria intimidated into silence, no one remained to advocate for basic human decency or common sense. Thompson hauled Amara to her feet with the efficiency of someone who had performed the maneuver countless times. She swayed unsteadily, her breathing labored and her complexion showing the grayish pallor that indicated inadequate oxygen circulation. The handcuffs had already begun to swell her hands as blood flow was restricted by metal designed for larger wrists. "Can you walk?" Thompson asked, though the question was more about logistics than concern for her welfare. He needed to move her from first class to somewhere she could be held until the aircraft landed and local authorities could take custody. Amara nodded weakly, though each breath required conscious effort and her vision was beginning to blur around the edges. The stress of the confrontation had triggered her asthma, but the tight handcuffs and physical restraint were making it impossible for her to use the breathing techniques that usually helped her manage attacks. As Thompson began to march her toward the rear of the aircraft, James Wilson continued recording discreetly, capturing video that would later be viewed millions of times and analyzed by civil rights attorneys, federal investigators, and medical experts who would testify about the clear signs of distress that everyone in the cabin should have recognized. The last thing Amara saw before being led away from first class was Sandra's satisfied smile and Mrs. Cooper's approving nod. She had been judged, convicted, and sentenced by people who knew nothing about her except the color of her skin and their assumptions about where she belonged. Behind them, Dr. Rodriguez sat back down heavily, his face pale with the recognition that he had just witnessed something that violated every principle of justice and human dignity he had spent his career upholding. The Christmas music continued playing softly through the cabin speakers, but the holiday magic was gone, replaced by something much darker that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. The galley area at the rear of first class became Amara's prison, though Thompson preferred to think of it as a temporary holding area where security threats could be contained until proper disposal. The space was cramped and utilitarian, designed for food service rather than human occupancy, with sharp corners and hard surfaces that would become increasingly dangerous as Amara's medical condition deteriorated. Thompson positioned her on a small jump seat typically used by flight attendants during takeoff and landing, but the handcuffs made it impossible for her to sit comfortably or safely. Her arms, pulled behind her back and secured with restraints designed for adult male suspects, forced her into an unnatural posture that put additional strain on her already compromised breathing. Sir Maria Santos approached hesitantly, her professional training as a flight attendant conflicting with her fear of contradicting federal authority. "Maybe I should get the medical kit. She doesn't look well." Thompson's response revealed the fundamental flaw in his approach to security. Rather than welcoming additional safety measures, he interpreted Maria's concern as questioning of his judgment and expertise. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm trained to assess suspect medical status. She's displaying typical resistance behaviors designed to avoid consequences for her actions." The clinical description transformed Amara's obvious medical distress into a manipulative performance, allowing Thompson to dismiss clear signs of crisis as evidence of guilt rather than innocence. In his experience, suspects often claimed medical problems to avoid prosecution or generate sympathy from observers. But Amara's condition was deteriorating rapidly beyond any possibility of performance. Her breathing had become increasingly labored, with each inhalation requiring visible effort and producing minimal oxygen exchange. The stress-induced asthma attack triggered by the physical confrontation was being exacerbated by the tight handcuffs restricting blood flow and the unnatural position forcing her chest into compression. Sandra joined them in the galley area, her expression showing satisfaction at seeing the situation resolved through decisive action. In her mind, Thompson's intervention had validated her initial assessment and proven her experience and judgment superior to the misguided sympathy expressed by passengers who didn't understand security realities. "How long until we can get her off my aircraft?" Sandra asked Thompson, as if Amara were cargo to be unloaded rather than a human being in medical distress. "Captain says about 10 minutes until we can return to the gate," Thompson replied. "Local authorities will take custody once we're on the ground." The casual discussion of Amara's fate, as if she weren't present, revealed the complete dehumanization that had occurred during the confrontation. She had been reduced to a problem to be solved, rather than a person with rights, feelings, and legitimate medical needs that required immediate attention. Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the galley entrance, his medical bag in hand, and his expression showing the grim determination of someone who had decided to prioritize his oath to do no harm over his reluctance to challenge federal authority. "Officer, I need to examine this patient immediately," he announced using medical rather than criminal terminology to reframe the situation. She's showing clear signs of respiratory distress that could become life-threatening if not addressed. Thompson positioned himself between Dr. Rodriguez and Amara, his stance radiating the kind of territorial aggression that indicated he viewed any intervention as a personal challenge to his authority and competence. "Doctor, I understand you want to help, but this suspect is in federal custody. I can't allow civilians to interfere with a security situation. This isn't a security situation anymore, Doctor," Rodriguez replied firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions under pressure. "This is a medical emergency, and federal regulations require you to allow medical intervention when passenger safety is at risk." The mention of federal regulations should have given Thompson pause to reconsider his approach, but his training had emphasized the importance of maintaining control over security situations once they began. Backing down or allowing outside interference could be interpreted as weakness that might encourage further challenges to his authority. Meanwhile, Amara's condition continued to worsen with frightening rapidity. Her lips, which had been pink when she boarded the aircraft, were now taking on the bluish tint that indicated inadequate oxygen circulation. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, the kind of respiratory pattern that medical professionals recognize as a precursor to complete respiratory failure. The handcuffs were cutting off circulation to her hands, causing them to swell and turn purple in a way that would have been immediately obvious to anyone looking for signs of distress rather than signs of resistance. But Thompson had been trained to focus on compliance and control rather than medical indicators, and Sandra's prejudice prevented her from recognizing symptoms that contradicted her narrative about Amara's deceptive behavior. "Please," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible over the aircraft's engine noise and the increasingly labored sound of her breathing. I can't breathe properly." The plea should have triggered immediate medical intervention according to federal aviation regulations, airline policies, and basic human decency. But Thompson had committed to a narrative that characterized any complaints from Amara as manipulative attempts to avoid consequences for her alleged crimes. "Ma'am, if you cooperate fully and stop trying to generate sympathy, this process will go much smoother for everyone involved." Thompson replied, his tone suggesting that her medical distress was entirely voluntary and could be resolved through better behavior. Dr. Rodriguez pushed past Thompson despite the potential legal consequences, his medical oath overriding his concern for federal authority when faced with obvious patient deterioration. He knelt beside Amara and immediately began assessing her condition with the rapid efficiency of someone trained to recognize emergency situations. Pulse is rapid and thready. Respiration is labored and shallow skin color indicates hypoxia, he announced in medical terminology that carried unmistakable urgency. "Officer, this patient is having a serious medical emergency that requires immediate intervention." Thompson grabbed Dr. Rodriguez's shoulder and pulled him back from Amara, his action crossing the line from security measures into assault on a medical professional attempting to provide emergency care. "Sir, I warned you about interfering with federal custody. I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction of a federal officer." The threat to arrest a doctor for attempting to provide medical care to someone in obvious distress revealed how completely Thompson had lost perspective on the situation. He was now willing to commit multiple federal crimes himself to maintain control over a situation that had never required his intervention in the first place. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom arrangement, cutting through the confrontation with information that would have resolved everything immediately if anyone had been listening to evidence rather than assumptions. "Flight attendants, please prepare for return to gate. We've received clearance for immediate taxi back to terminal. Also, I've been contacted by Johnson Global Logistics corporate office regarding their executive family member traveling in seat 2A. Please ensure all courtesy protocols are followed." The announcement hung in the air like a verdict from a higher court. Johnson Global Logistics was not a made-up company name that Amara had invented to impress people. It was a real corporation with sufficient influence to contact aircraft captains directly and demand explanations for delays involving their executives' family members. Sandra's face went white as the implications of the captain's announcement penetrated her consciousness. If Amara really was connected to Johnson Global Logistics, then everything Sandra had done was not only wrong, but catastrophically wrong in ways that would destroy her career and potentially result in criminal charges. But instead of immediately releasing Amara and calling for medical assistance, Sandra doubled down on her original assessment, driven by the psychological need to avoid admitting she had made a mistake that could ruin her life. "That doesn't prove anything," Sandra said desperately. "Corporate offices get scammed all the time by people claiming to be employees or family members. She probably called them herself to create this fake emergency." The reasoning was so convoluted and desperate that it revealed Sandra's complete detachment from reality. She was now proposing that Amara had somehow anticipated being challenged by flight crew, planned her responses in advance, and arranged for fake corporate intervention while handcuffed and in medical distress. Thompson, equally invested in avoiding responsibility for his actions, seized on Sandra's explanation as justification for continuing his restraint of someone who was now clearly in medical crisis. The suspect could have accomplices on the ground creating false verification, he agreed. "We need to maintain security protocols until local authorities can properly investigate." Dr. Rodriguez looked between Sandra and Thompson with the horrified recognition that he was dealing with people who had moved beyond rational thought into a kind of shared delusion that would prevent them from acknowledging obvious reality, even when confronted with clear evidence. "You're both out of your minds," he said, with the blunt honesty of someone who had decided that professional courtesy was less important than preventing a preventable death. "This child is going to die if you don't remove those handcuffs and get her medical attention right now." Maria Santos, who had been watching the confrontation with growing terror, finally found her voice despite Sandra's earlier threats about her employment. "Sandra, look at her hands. Look at her face. She's turning blue. Whatever this is about, it's not worth killing someone." The word killing cut through the galley like a blade, forcing everyone to confront the potential consequences of their actions in terms that could not be rationalized or minimized. This was no longer about customer service security protocols or corporate policies. It was about life and death. But Sandra and Thompson had gone too far down their chosen path to turn back without admitting errors that would destroy their careers and potentially result in criminal prosecution. The psychological pressure to continue their course of action had become stronger than their ability to process new information or acknowledge their mistakes. "She's faking it," Sandra insisted, though her voice now carried a note of desperation that suggested even she was beginning to doubt her own assessment. "Young people today are very sophisticated about creating sympathy through performance." "Performance?" Dr. Rodriguez's voice rose in disbelief. "You think she's performing cyanosis? You think she's acting her way to oxygen deprivation?" The medical terminology highlighted the absurdity of Sandra's position, but people who are psychologically invested in wrong decisions often become more resistant to evidence as the stakes increase, rather than more willing to change course. Thompson was facing a similar psychological crisis. Admitting that he had physically assaulted and restrained an innocent teenager would end his federal career and potentially result in civil rights charges that could send him to prison. The pressure to justify his actions had become overwhelming, driving him to seek evidence that supported his narrative rather than evidence that revealed the truth. Federal training teaches us that criminals often use medical emergencies as escape mechanisms, Thompson said, reciting doctrine that was accurate in some contexts, but completely inappropriate in this situation. Suspects claim heart attacks, seizures, breathing problems, anything to avoid consequences. "This isn't a claim," Dr. Rodriguez replied with mounting frustration at the willful blindness he was witnessing. "This is observable medical reality. Her oxygen saturation is dropping, her circulation is compromised, and her respiratory arrangement is failing. These are not symptoms that can be faked, but facts had become irrelevant to people who had too much invested in being right. to admit they might be wrong. Sandra and Thompson were now facing a choice between acknowledging their mistakes and allowing someone to die rather than admit error. For people whose identities were built around being authority figures who made correct decisions, the psychological pressure to choose the second option was becoming overwhelming. James Wilson continued recording from his position near the galley, his phone capturing video that would later be analyzed by medical experts, legal scholars, and civil rights investigators. His footage would provide undeniable documentation of the deterioration in Amara's condition and the refusal of authority figures to provide assistance despite obvious medical emergency. The most damning evidence would be Thompson's next statement, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic detachment that treats human suffering as an administrative problem to be managed rather than a crisis to be resolved. Local authorities can determine her medical status once we're on the ground. Our priority is maintaining security until proper handover can be achieved. Dr. Rodriguez stood up slowly, his face showing the kind of moral exhaustion that comes from recognizing that some people will choose to be wrong rather than admit they were wrong even when lives hang in the balance. "When this child dies," he said quietly, "and the world sees exactly how she died, I hope you both remember this moment. I hope you remember that you chose to be right instead of choosing to be human." The prophecy hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, filling the galley with the acrid smell of consequences that could no longer be avoided. The aircraft's intercom arrangement crackled to life with the mechanical urgency that accompanied genuine emergencies rather than routine announcements. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried a tension that immediately commanded the attention of everyone aboard Flight 447, transforming the cabin atmosphere from holiday relaxation to crisis management. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are declaring a medical emergency and will be making an immediate diversion to Dublin Airport. Please remain in your seats with safety belts fastened as we begin emergency descent procedures. Flight attendants, prepare for priority landing protocol." The announcement hit the first-class cabin like a thunderclap, instantly clarifying for everyone except Sandra and Thompson that Amara's medical distress was genuine enough to trigger international emergency procedures that would cost the airline thousands of dollars and create diplomatic complications with multiple air traffic control operations. Dr. Rodriguez felt a surge of relief that common sense had finally prevailed somewhere in the aircraft's command structure, but his medical assessment of Amara's condition told him that even emergency intervention might be too late. Her breathing had become increasingly shallow and erratic, the kind of respiratory pattern that preceded complete arrangement failure. "Captain's declaring medical emergency for a faker," Sandra said desperately, her voice now carrying the high-pitched quality that indicated someone whose grip on reality was slipping under pressure. "This is going to cost the company millions for nothing." But Captain Rodriguez had access to information that Sandra and Thompson had been ignoring or dismissing. The call from Johnson Global Logistics had not been routine corporate communication. It had been an urgent inquiry from one of the airline's most important clients about the welfare of a family member traveling under their account. Monica Williams, David Johnson's executive assistant, had been tracking Flight 447's progress when she received an automated alert that the aircraft was no longer following its filed flight plan. Her attempts to contact the aircraft directly had resulted in a conversation with Captain Rodriguez that revealed the existence of a security situation involving someone named Amara Johnson. The combination of the name, the seat assignment, and the security situation had triggered immediate recognition of exactly who was involved and what the consequences would be if anything happened to her. Captain Rodriguez found himself speaking directly with the personal assistant of someone who could destroy Coastal Airlines with a single phone call, and her questions about Amara's welfare left no doubt about the gravity of the situation. "Captain, this is Monica Williams calling from Johnson Global Logistics." Her voice had carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate answers from corporate executives. "We need immediate confirmation of the welfare status of Amara Johnson in Seat 2A. She is the daughter of our CEO, and any issues involving her safety are to be treated as highest priority corporate emergencies." The revelation that Amara was not just connected to Johnson Global Logistics, but was the daughter of its CEO transformed the situation from customer service dispute to corporate crisis that could bankrupt the airline if mishandled. Captain Rodriguez immediately understood that he was dealing with someone whose father had the resources and motivation to pursue legal action that could destroy careers and companies. But in the galley, Sandra and Thompson remained psychologically unable to process information that contradicted their committed narrative. They had invested too much in being right to acknowledge evidence that they were catastrophically wrong, even when that evidence came from the aircraft's captain and the corporate office of their passenger's family. Corporate clients lie to protect their executives' family members. Thompson said, his rationalization becoming increasingly desperate as reality closed in around his false assumptions. They'll say anything to avoid scandal or embarrassment. Dr. Rodriguez abandoned any pretense of professional courtesy in the face of willful ignorance that was literally killing someone in front of his eyes. He pushed past Thompson again, this time prepared to physically fight the federal officer if necessary to provide medical care. "Get away from my patient," he said with the kind of quiet intensity that indicated someone had reached the limit of their tolerance for bureaucratic stupidity. "I'm a physician. She's in respiratory failure, and if you try to stop me again, I'll file federal charges for interference with emergency medical care." The threat carried weight because Dr. Rodriguez was correct about federal regulations requiring law enforcement to allow medical intervention during genuine emergencies. Thompson's continued refusal to permit medical examination was itself a federal crime that could result in prosecution and imprisonment. But Thompson had passed the point where legal or ethical considerations could penetrate his psychological commitment to avoiding admission of error. He was now willing to commit additional crimes to cover up his original mistakes, a spiral of poor decision-making that would ultimately destroy his life and freedom. "Sir, this suspect is in federal custody, and I cannot allow civilian interference regardless of claimed credentials," Thompson replied, though his voice now carried uncertainty that suggested even he was beginning to doubt his position. Claimed credentials. Dr. Rodriguez pulled out his medical license and board certifications, displaying documentation that proved his qualifications to provide emergency care. "I'm a practicing cardiologist at Mount Sinai with 25 years of emergency medicine experience. Are you going to tell me I don't know respiratory failure when I see it?" The confrontation between medical expertise and federal authority created a moment of perfect clarity about the situation's fundamental absurdity. A trained physician with decades of experience was being prevented from treating obvious medical emergency by a security officer whose qualifications for medical assessment consisted entirely of his willingness to use force against a teenager. Maria Santos, who had been watching Amara's deteriorating condition with growing horror, made a decision that would save her job while costing Sandra and Thompson their careers. She activated the aircraft's medical emergency communication arrangement and began broadcasting directly to the captain. "Captain, this is Maria in the forward galley. We have a passenger in severe respiratory distress who appears to be losing consciousness. The federal air marshal is preventing medical examination, but Dr. Rodriguez from Seat 1A is requesting permission to provide emergency care." The transmission went out over multiple communication channels, simultaneously creating an official record of the medical emergency and the refusal to allow treatment that would later be analyzed by federal investigators and presented as evidence in criminal trials. Captain Rodriguez's response was immediate and unambiguous, cutting through Thompson's authority with the weight of federal aviation regulations that superseded law enforcement priorities during medical emergencies. Permission granted for all medical intervention necessary to preserve passenger life. "Officer Thompson, you are hereby directed to comply fully with medical personnel requests. This aircraft is operating under emergency medical protocols effective immediately." The captain's direct order eliminated Thompson's legal authority to prevent medical care, but psychological investment in wrong decisions often becomes stronger as pressure increases rather than weaker. Instead of complying with lawful orders, Thompson doubled down on his position in ways that would later be characterized as mutiny by federal prosecutors. "Captain, I have security concerns that override medical protocols," Thompson transmitted back, creating an official record of his refusal to obey direct orders during an emergency situation. This suspect's medical claims may be fabricated to facilitate escape or interference with federal custody. The response revealed the complete breakdown of Thompson's judgment under pressure. He was now claiming that emergency medical protocols could be ignored because of his personal suspicions about a handcuffed teenager's motivations, a position so legally and ethically indefensible that it would later be used as evidence of criminal intent. Dr. Rodriguez began his medical examination. Despite Thompson's continued interference, his professional competence providing stark contrast to the bureaucratic incompetence surrounding him. His assessment was rapid but thorough, confirming what had been obvious to anyone not blinded by prejudice or pride. Pulse weak and rapid blood pressure, dropping oxygen saturation critically low, he announced for the recording equipment that was capturing everything. Handcuffs are causing circulatory compromise, and the restraint position is restricting respiratory function. This patient needs immediate intervention or she will lose consciousness completely. The medical assessment provided objective documentation of exactly what was happening and why, creating evidence that would later be used to demonstrate that Amara's distress was genuine medical emergency rather than performance art designed to avoid consequences. But Sandra and Thompson had moved beyond the reach of evidence or reason into a psychological space where acknowledging error had become literally impossible. They were now trapped by their own pride and prejudice into a course of action that would destroy their lives while potentially ending Amara's. "She's still conscious," Sandra said, grasping at any detail that might support her narrative of deception. "If this was real, wouldn't she have passed out by now?" Dr. Rodriguez looked at Sandra with the kind of professional assessment usually reserved for evaluating psychiatric patients who had lost contact with reality. "Consciousness during medical emergency doesn't mean the emergency isn't real," he explained with the patience of someone addressing a child. "People remain conscious during heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory failure, right up until the moment their operations completely shut down." The explanation should have penetrated even the thickest fog of willful ignorance, but Sandra had reached a psychological state where new information was processed only for its potential to support existing beliefs rather than to reveal truth about the situation. Outside the aircraft, Dublin Air Traffic Control was coordinating emergency response procedures that would bring ambulances, medical personnel, and law enforcement to meet Flight 447 upon landing. The Irish authorities had been briefed on the nature of the medical emergency and the complications involving federal law enforcement that were preventing treatment. Unknown to anyone aboard the aircraft, David Johnson's private jet had taken off from London City Airport the moment Monica Williams reported the emergency situation involving his daughter. The Gulfstream G650 was capable of reaching Dublin in less time than it would take Flight 447 to complete its emergency landing, meaning that the most powerful shipping executive in the Western Hemisphere would be waiting on the tarmac when his daughter was removed from the aircraft. But in the galley of Flight 447, time was running out for common sense to prevail over pride and prejudice. Amara's medical condition had deteriorated to the point where even immediate intervention might not be sufficient to prevent permanent damage or death. Dr. Rodriguez made one final attempt to break through the psychological barriers that were preventing Sandra and Thompson from acknowledging their catastrophic errors in judgment. "Look at her," he said, simply gesturing toward Amara's obviously failing condition. "Just look at her and tell me what you see. Not what you want to see, not what you need to see to justify your actions, but what is actually in front of you." For a moment, silence filled the galley as Sandra and Thompson were forced to confront the reality they had been denying. But the moment passed without breakthrough, lost to pride that had become more important than truth and prejudice that had become more powerful than compassion. Dublin Airport's emergency response arrangement activated with the mechanical precision that characterized crisis management in modern aviation. Fire trucks, ambulances, and specialized rescue equipment began moving toward the designated emergency runway where Flight 447 would land in approximately 8 minutes. The Irish Air Traffic Control Center coordinated with multiple agencies, simultaneously ensuring that medical personnel would be standing by when the aircraft's doors opened. But coordination at 37,000 feet was breaking down completely, as human psychology proved less reliable than mechanical arrangements. In the first-class galley, Amara's consciousness was flickering like a candle in strong wind, her body's oxygen-starved operations beginning the shutdown process that preceded complete respiratory failure. Dr. Rodriguez had managed to position himself next to her, despite Thompson's continued interference, his medical bag open and emergency equipment ready. But the handcuffs prevented proper patient positioning, and Thompson's insistence on maintaining security protocols was making effective treatment impossible. "Officer, if you don't remove these restraints immediately, this patient is going to die," Dr. Rodriguez said with the blunt finality of someone who had reached the limit of professional patience. "Her circulation is compromised, her breathing is restricted, and the stress is causing complete cardiovascular collapse." Thompson's response revealed how completely his judgment had been corrupted by psychological investment in being right rather than being effective. Instead of focusing on the medical emergency unfolding in front of him, he was searching for procedural justifications for maintaining his original course of action. Federal regulations require suspects in custody to remain restrained unless they pose immediate escape risk, Thompson recited, though the regulation he was quoting was designed for ground-based situations and had no application to medical emergencies aboard aircraft. "I cannot compromise security protocols without proper authorization." Authorization from whom Dr. Rodriguez asked with disbelief that bordered on fury. God. The Pope. Who exactly do you think has higher authority than the Hippocratic Oath during a medical emergency? The question highlighted the fundamental conflict between bureaucratic procedure and human necessity that was playing out in the galley. Thompson had been trained to follow regulations and maintain control, but he had never been trained to recognize when those priorities should yield to higher moral and legal obligations. Sandra remained committed to her original assessment, despite mounting evidence that contradicted every aspect of her judgment. The captain's emergency declaration, the corporate involvement, the obvious medical distress. All of it was being filtered through prejudice so deeply ingrained that facts could not penetrate her consciousness. "This is all performance," Sandra insisted, though her voice now carried the shrill quality of someone whose grip on reality was slipping under pressure. "Young people today are incredibly sophisticated about manipulating adults through fake medical emergencies. I've seen it before." When Dr. Rodriguez demanded, "When have you seen someone fake cyanosis? When have you seen someone perform their way to oxygen deprivation? Give me specific examples of teenagers who acted their way into respiratory failure." The challenge exposed the emptiness of Sandra's claims, but people who have committed to wrong positions often become more defensive when confronted with evidence rather than more willing to reconsider their stance. Meanwhile, Captain Rodriguez was coordinating with Dublin Control Tower, while simultaneously trying to understand why his direct orders regarding medical care were not being followed. His communications with air traffic control were creating an official record of the emergency situation that would later be analyzed by investigators trying to determine exactly what had gone wrong. Dublin Control Coastal 447 requesting immediate priority approach. "We have passenger in severe medical distress with complications involving federal law enforcement refusal to allow treatment." The transmission revealed that the situation had escalated beyond simple medical emergency into something that would require diplomatic coordination between American and Irish authorities once the aircraft was on the ground. "Coastal 447, you are cleared for immediate approach, runway 28, emergency services standing by. Be advised we have received notification that a private aircraft is also requesting priority landing with passenger requiring immediate access to your medical emergency." The second aircraft was David Johnson's private jet, though Captain Rodriguez didn't yet understand the full implications of what was being coordinated on the ground. Dublin's air traffic control arrangement was managing the simultaneous arrival of two aircraft carrying what they had been told were related passengers, one in medical distress and one with urgent business regarding that medical situation. James Wilson continued documenting everything from his position near the galley, his phone capturing video that would later be viewed by millions of people and analyzed by legal experts attempting to understand how the situation had deteriorated so completely. His footage would provide undeniable evidence of the timeline and the refusal to provide medical care despite obvious need. 5 minutes to landing, Captain Rodriguez announced over the intercom. Medical personnel, please prepare patient for immediate transport upon arrival. The announcement should have triggered final preparation for Amara's transfer to emergency care, but Thompson interpreted it as pressure to complete his security protocols before losing control of the situation to Irish authorities. Ma'am, I need you to confirm your identity and the nature of your medical claims for the official record, Thompson said to Amara, though she was now barely conscious and struggling to focus her eyes enough to understand what was being said to her. Dr. Rodriguez realized that Thompson had moved beyond poor judgment into active endangerment of human life through willful refusal to acknowledge obvious medical emergency. She can't respond because she's dying, he said with the kind of clinical precision that cut through bureaucratic euphemism to reveal underlying reality. Lack of response isn't evidence of deception. It's evidence of brain hypoxia caused by respiratory failure. But Thompson had committed himself so completely to his original assessment that evidence of its wrongness was being processed as evidence of more sophisticated deception rather than as reason to change course. Suspects often use decreased responsiveness to avoid questioning, Thompson replied, reciting training that was accurate in some contexts but catastrophically inappropriate in this medical emergency. The exchange was being recorded by multiple sources and would later be played in courtrooms where federal judges would struggle to understand how trained professionals could ignore such obvious medical crisis. But in the moment, psychological investment in being right had become more powerful than professional obligation to preserve life. Maria Santos made a final attempt to break through the madness that had consumed her colleagues and was threatening to cost someone their life. Sandra, look at her hands, she said desperately. Look at her face. Look at how she's breathing. This isn't performance. This is someone dying. Sandra's response revealed the complete psychological break that had occurred as pressure mounted and evidence accumulated against her position. Maria, if you can't support the crew during security situations, maybe this job isn't for you, Sandra replied, threatening her colleague's employment as a way of avoiding acknowledgement that she might be wrong about something so fundamental that being wrong would destroy her career. But career destruction was exactly what was about to happen to everyone involved in denying medical care to someone whose father had the resources and motivation to pursue justice through every available legal channel. On the ground in Dublin, David Johnson's private jet was completing its final approach to the same airport, where his daughter would land in less than 3 minutes. He had spent the flight from London coordinating with legal teams, medical specialists, and corporate security personnel who were already investigating exactly what had happened aboard Flight 447. The investigation had already revealed enough information to confirm that Amara was a legitimate passenger who had been subjected to discrimination, assault, and denial of medical care by people whose prejudice had overridden their professional judgment and basic human decency. What remained to be determined was whether the people responsible would be held accountable for their actions or whether their institutional authority would protect them from consequences that would destroy ordinary citizens who committed similar crimes. The aircraft began its final descent toward Dublin, carrying with it a young woman fighting for her life and the people whose decisions would determine whether she survived to see justice served. The Dublin tarmac on December 24th was illuminated by emergency lights that painted everything in stark red and white, creating a scene that looked more like a crime scene than a routine medical emergency. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police vehicles surrounded the arrival gate where Flight 447 would complete its unscheduled landing in less than 2 minutes. David Johnson's Gulfstream G650 touched down on a parallel runway with the precision that characterized everything about the shipping magnate's approach to problems that threatened his family. The private jet taxied directly toward the commercial aircraft's arrival gate, its corporate registration numbers visible to anyone who cared to research the identity of its owner. Inside the emergency vehicles, Irish medical personnel and Gardaí officers had been briefed on the complex situation they were about to encounter, a medical emergency involving an American teenager's civil rights violations by airline crew and the imminent arrival of someone described by Dublin Air Traffic Control as extremely high-priority corporate executive with significant diplomatic connections. What they had not been told was that the teenager fighting for her life and the corporate executive were father and daughter, or that David Johnson had spent the 40-minute flight from London coordinating legal and medical resources that would make this incident one of the most expensive mistakes in aviation history. Flight 447's wheels touched the runway with the gentle precision that marked emergency landings by experienced crews under pressure. Captain Rodriguez guided the aircraft to its assigned gate, while emergency vehicles moved into position around the plane, their lights creating a constellation of urgency against the dark Irish sky. Inside the first-class cabin, the landing should have brought relief and resolution. Instead, it triggered final desperate attempts by Sandra and Thompson to maintain control over a situation that had already moved far beyond their authority or understanding. Local authorities will need to verify federal custody protocols before taking custody of the suspect, Thompson announced, though he had no legal basis for delaying medical treatment once the aircraft was on the ground in Irish territory. Dr. Rodriguez was already preparing Amara for transport, his medical equipment ready and his assessment complete. Her condition had stabilized slightly during the descent, as cabin pressure changes relieved some of the respiratory stress, but she remained critical and in need of immediate hospitalization. Officer. The moment those doors open, this patient is going to Irish medical personnel who will treat her according to international emergency protocols, Dr. Rodriguez said with finality. Your federal authority ends at the aircraft door. But Sandra and Thompson were both psychologically unable to accept that their control over the situation was ending. They had invested too much in being right to acknowledge that they had been catastrophically wrong about everything from Amara's identity to her medical condition to their legal authority to deny her care. The aircraft's engines wound down to silence, and the announcement came over the intercom that passengers should remain seated while emergency personnel boarded. But the first people through the aircraft door weren't paramedics or Irish police. They were David Johnson and 2 men in expensive suits who moved with the purposeful efficiency of people accustomed to handling crises that could destroy companies. David Johnson stepped into the first-class cabin and immediately commanded every eye and ounce of attention in the space. At 51 years old, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from building a $12 billion empire through strategic intelligence rather than inherited privilege. His presence filled the cabin without requiring dramatic gestures or raised voices. "Where is my daughter?" The voice cut through the cabin like thunder rolling across a silent landscape. David Johnson didn't shout. He didn't have to. When you own fleets of ships that feed half the world and employ hundreds of thousands of people across 6 continents, your whisper carries the weight of storms. Sandra felt her world shift on its axis as she realized exactly who was standing in front of her and what his presence meant for everything she had done during the past 2 hours. This was not some scammer's accomplice or corporate impersonator. This was actually David Johnson, whose company appeared regularly in Fortune 500 rankings and whose business decisions affected global shipping rates. Thompson experienced a similar moment of recognition as his military training kicked in to assess threats and calculate odds of survival. He had just spent 2 hours restraining and denying medical care to someone whose father could purchase small countries if he chose to, and whose resources for pursuing legal vengeance were essentially unlimited. The two men with David Johnson were not bodyguards or corporate assistants. They were attorneys from Kravitz and Associates, the most aggressive civil rights law firm in New York. Their presence indicated that this was not going to be resolved through apologies or corporate settlement offers. This was going to be pursued through legal channels that could result in criminal prosecution and personal bankruptcy. David Johnson's gaze swept across the first-class cabin, taking in the emergency medical equipment, the obvious signs of struggle, and the guilty expressions of people who knew they had been caught committing unforgivable acts. His assessment was rapid and complete, the kind of strategic analysis that had made him one of the most successful business leaders of his generation. 17 hours ago, my daughter boarded this aircraft as a legitimate first-class passenger. He said, his voice maintaining perfect control while radiating contained fury. She was handcuffed, denied medical care, and brought to the edge of death by people who decided she didn't belong in a seat she had every right to occupy. The summary was delivered with prosecutorial precision, each fact stated clearly for the recording equipment that was capturing everything. David Johnson had not come to Dublin seeking explanations or apologies. He had come to ensure that justice would be served completely and publicly. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, his medical bag in hand, and his expression showing the relief of someone who finally saw competent authority arriving to handle an impossible situation. Mr. Johnson, I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I've been trying to provide medical care for your daughter, but I've been prevented by the flight crew and federal officer. She's suffered significant respiratory distress and needs immediate hospitalization. David Johnson nodded acknowledgement to the doctor, while his attorneys began documenting everything they observed. The legal team was already building cases that would be filed in federal court before Flight 447's passengers finished clearing customs. Doctor, thank you for attempting to provide care under impossible circumstances, David Johnson replied. Irish medical personnel are standing by to transport her immediately. As if summoned by his words, Dublin emergency medical technicians appeared at the aircraft door with specialized equipment for transferring critical patients. They moved with the efficiency of professionals who had been briefed on the situation and were prepared to provide immediate care without requiring explanations or justifications. Sandra made one final desperate attempt to control the narrative, her psychological investment in being right overriding her growing recognition of the consequences she was facing. Mr. Johnson, I'm sure this looks bad, but your daughter was presenting questionable documentation and behaving in ways that suggested security concerns, she said, though her voice now carried the defeated quality of someone who knew their excuses would not be accepted. David Johnson turned his attention to Sandra with the kind of focused intensity that had made him successful in negotiations with world leaders and corporate executives. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. 15 minutes ago, you handcuffed my daughter until she stopped breathing, he said, each word precisely articulated for maximum impact. In 15 more minutes, your career will be over, and criminal charges will be filed against you in federal court. The prediction was delivered not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, the kind of inevitable consequence that followed from specific actions as naturally as night followed day. David Johnson was not making emotional pronouncements. He was describing legal and professional realities that would unfold regardless of any apologies or explanations Sandra might offer. Thompson attempted to assert his federal authority one final time, though he was beginning to understand that his authority meant nothing in the face of someone with David Johnson's resources and connections. Sir, I was following proper federal security protocols, Thompson said, though his voice lacked conviction and his body language suggested someone who knew he had made mistakes that would destroy his life. David Johnson's response revealed exactly how thoroughly he had already investigated the situation and how completely he understood the legal violations that had been committed. Officer Thompson, You assaulted a minor denied medical care during an emergency and refused to obey direct orders from your commanding officer, David Johnson, replied with clinical precision. Federal prosecutors will determine how many years in prison those actions are worth. The legal assessment was accurate and devastating, delivered by someone who had access to the best legal minds in the country and the resources to pursue prosecution, regardless of cost or complexity. As Irish medical personnel moved Amara toward the ambulance that would transport her to Dublin's best private hospital, David Johnson delivered his final statement to the people who had nearly killed his daughter through prejudice and incompetence. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you have made enemies of people who never forget and never forgive. Sleep well, St. James's Hospital." Dublin became a fortress of corporate security and legal activity within an hour of Amara Johnson's arrival. David Johnson had immediately bought exclusive access to an entire wing of the private medical facility, ensuring his daughter would receive the finest care while maintaining privacy from media attention that was already building around the incident. The medical assessment confirmed Dr. Rodriguez's emergency diagnosis with terrifying precision. Amara had suffered hypoxic brain injury from prolonged oxygen deprivation, circulatory damage from improper restraint application, and psychological trauma from assault and public humiliation. The Irish medical team, led by Dr. Siobhan O'Brien, one of Europe's leading specialists in aviation medical emergencies, worked through the night to stabilize her condition. The handcuff placement was criminally negligent, Dr. O'Brien reported to David Johnson as he maintained vigil beside his daughter's bed. "Another 10 minutes, and we would have been looking at permanent brain damage or death." The restraints were applied with excessive force to someone who posed no physical threat. The medical documentation was building into evidence that would support both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Each photograph of Amara's injuries, each measurement of circulation damage, each assessment of psychological trauma was being preserved for legal proceedings that would make this case a landmark in aviation civil rights law. Meanwhile, back aboard Flight 447, Irish Gardaí officers were conducting formal interviews with passengers and crew members, while federal investigators began building criminal cases against Sandra Martinez and Blake Thompson. The coordination between American and Irish law enforcement was unprecedented for a commercial aviation incident, reflecting the diplomatic pressure being applied by someone with David Johnson's international connections. Sandra's immediate termination came via phone call before she had even left the aircraft. Coastal Airlines CEO Robert Hayes personally delivered the news while she sat in custody waiting for formal processing by Irish authorities. "Sandra, effective immediately. You are terminated from employment with Coastal Airlines," Hayes said through her lawyer's speakerphone. "Your actions have exposed this company to legal liability that could exceed our insurance coverage. Security will escort you from company property, and your pension benefits are forfeited under the criminal conduct clause of your employment contract." The financial destruction was swift and complete. Sandra's 15 years with the company, her accumulated benefits, her professional reputation, all of it evaporated in a single phone call delivered with corporate efficiency. But the economic consequences were just the beginning of accountability that would follow her for the rest of her life. Thompson's federal career ended with similar brutal efficiency. A review board convened via emergency teleconference while he was still in Irish custody, stripping him of his credentials and recommending criminal prosecution for civil rights violations, assault, and failure to obey lawful orders during a federal emergency. Agent Thompson's actions represent a complete failure of judgment that endangered passenger life and violated multiple federal statutes. The review board's chairman announced during a press conference that was broadcast internationally. The Transportation Security Administration has zero tolerance for discrimination and excessive force by federal officers. But the immediate terminations and official condemnation were just the first wave of consequences that would follow from the incident. David Johnson's legal team was already preparing comprehensive litigation that would pursue not just individual accountability, but institutional changes that would prevent similar incidents throughout the aviation industry. Monica Williams, David Johnson's executive assistant, coordinated the legal response from a war room established in the hospital's conference facility. Multiple law firms specializing in civil rights aviation law and international litigation were working simultaneously to build cases that would be filed in courts across multiple jurisdictions. Criminal charges in Ireland and the United States, Monica reported to David Johnson during one of her hourly briefings. Civil rights violations under federal law, assault charges under Irish law, and civil liability suits that could reach 9 figures. The airline's stock has dropped 30% since news broke. The financial impact on coastal airlines was immediate and catastrophic. Besides the stock price collapse, corporate clients were canceling contracts and social media campaigns. Calling for boycotts were gaining momentum with hashtags like Justice for Amara and No More Discrimination trending worldwide. The viral video captured by James Wilson had been viewed more than 10 million times within the first 12 hours, showing the world exactly how a black teenager had been treated by airline employees who assumed she didn't belong in first class. The footage provided undeniable documentation of everything from the initial confrontation to the denial of medical care. But the most damaging evidence came from the aircraft's own recording operations. Flight data recorders and cabin voice recordings captured every word of the confrontation, providing federal prosecutors with audio evidence of discriminatory language, refusal to follow emergency protocols, and deliberate indifference to obvious medical distress. The recordings are devastating, federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh explained to her staff during an emergency briefing. We have clear audio of discrimination based on race denial of medical care during emergency situation and federal officers refusing to obey direct orders. This case will be textbook prosecution material for civil rights violations. The legal machinery was moving with unusual speed because David Johnson's resources allowed for immediate access to the best legal minds in the world. While most victims of discrimination faced years of legal struggles with limited resources, Amara's case was being handled by teams of specialists who could pursue justice without concern for costs or complexity. Dr. Rodriguez, who had attempted to provide medical care despite federal interference, found himself celebrated as a hero in medical and legal circles. His documentation of Amara's condition and his willingness to challenge federal authority to provide care made him a key witness, whose testimony would be crucial in establishing the timeline and severity of the medical emergency. Dr. Rodriguez's actions represent the highest standards of medical ethics, the American Medical Association announced in a formal statement. His willingness to prioritize patient care over bureaucratic authority exemplifies the principles every physician swears to uphold. But heroism and legal victories could not immediately heal the damage that had been done to a 17-year-old girl who had simply wanted to surprise her father on Christmas morning. Amara remained unconscious in intensive care, her body fighting to recover from trauma that should never have occurred to anyone regardless of their race, age, or economic status. The psychological counseling team that David Johnson had assembled included specialists in trauma recovery, racial discrimination, and adolescent development. They were preparing treatment protocols for when Amara regained consciousness, recognizing that her physical healing would be only part of the recovery process. The psychological impact of public humiliation combined with physical assault can have lasting effects on young people. Dr. Margaret Chen, a leading adolescent psychologist, explained to the treatment team, "We'll need to address not just this incident, but the broader context of how it fits into her life experience as a young black woman." Meanwhile, the broader aviation industry was beginning to grapple with questions about training accountability and institutional culture that had allowed such discrimination to occur. The Federal Aviation Administration announced immediate reviews of civil rights training for all airline personnel while Congress began discussing hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation. This incident represents widespread failures that extend far beyond individual bad actors, Congresswoman Maria Gonzalez announced during a press conference. We need comprehensive reform that ensures every passenger is treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. But all the legal proceedings, policy reforms, and institutional changes would be meaningless if Amara did not survive to see justice served. As Christmas morning dawned over Dublin, David Johnson sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, holding her hand and waiting for her to wake up so he could tell her that the people who had hurt her would face consequences for their actions. The question was whether those consequences would be sufficient to restore faith in a justice that had failed her so completely aboard Flight 447. The Dublin courtroom where Sandra Martinez and Blake Thompson faced preliminary charges was packed with international media civil rights observers and legal scholars who recognized they were witnessing a landmark case in aviation discrimination law. Irish prosecutors had fast-tracked the criminal proceedings at the request of American federal authorities, creating unprecedented cooperation between jurisdictions in pursuing justice for civil rights violations. Judge Patrick O'Sullivan, one of Ireland's most respected legal minds, presided over proceedings that would establish international precedents for how discrimination cases involving American citizens abroad would be handled. His opening remarks set a tone of gravity that reflected the seriousness of the charges and the international attention focused on the case. The actions we are here to examine represent not merely individual failures of judgment, but institutional failures that endangered human life through prejudice and incompetence, Judge O'Sullivan announced. This court will determine appropriate consequences for those failures. Sandra sat at the defendant's table. Her appearance dramatically changed from the polished professional who had commanded the first-class cabin just weeks earlier. The stress of legal proceedings, financial destruction, and public condemnation had aged her, visibly transforming her from confident authority figure to someone who looked defeated before proceedings had even begun. Her legal representation consisted of a single, overworked public defender since her termination from Coastal Airlines had eliminated access to corporate legal support, and her personal finances had been exhausted by preliminary legal costs. The contrast with David Johnson's team of international litigation specialists highlighted the resource disparity that would characterize every aspect of the case. Thompson faced even more serious charges, since his federal law enforcement status had elevated simple assault into civil rights violations under color of law. His military decorations and years of service meant nothing in the face of video evidence showing him restraining an unconscious teenager while refusing medical assistance. The evidence will show that Agent Thompson used his federal authority to commit crimes that would be unacceptable for any citizen prosecutor, Siobhan Murphy announced during her opening statement. When law enforcement officers violate civil rights, the law demands more severe consequences, not more lenient treatment. The prosecution's case was built around three types of evidence that proved impossible to refute or rationalize: video documentation from multiple sources, audio recordings from the aircraft's operations, and medical testimony about the severity of Amara's condition and the preventable nature of her injuries. Dr. Rodriguez testified with clinical precision about the medical emergency and the refusal to allow treatment, his credibility as a respected physician making his testimony devastating to the defense's attempts to portray the situation as anything other than criminal negligence. Ms. Martinez and Agent Thompson chose to maintain their narrative of suspicion, even when confronted with obvious medical crisis, Dr. Rodriguez stated under oath. Their decisions were not made based on security concerns or passenger safety. They were made based on prejudice that prevented them from recognizing obvious reality. The medical evidence presented by Dublin emergency specialists confirmed that another 10 minutes of restraint would have caused permanent brain damage or death. Photographs of Amara's injuries, measurements of circulation damage, and documentation of psychological trauma created a comprehensive picture of harm caused by discrimination and excessive force. But the most damaging testimony came from aviation experts who analyzed the crew's failures to follow standard protocols for customer service disputes, medical emergencies, and federal regulations governing passenger rights. Their analysis demonstrated that every decision made by Sandra and Thompson violated established procedures and legal requirements. Standard protocol would have resolved this situation in less than 5 minutes through simple verification of passenger manifest data, aviation consultant Dr. Robert Kim testified. The crew's refusal to follow basic verification procedures suggests prejudice rather than security concerns motivated their actions. The defense's strategy focused on portraying Sandra and Thompson as dedicated professionals who made reasonable decisions under pressure, but video evidence made such arguments impossible to sustain. The recordings showed clear discrimination, excessive force, and deliberate indifference to medical emergency that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. My client believed she was protecting passenger safety. Sandra's attorney argued desperately. She acted in good faith based on her professional experience and training. But Judge O'Sullivan's response reflected the court's assessment of arguments that contradicted obvious evidence. Counselor good faith cannot explain refusal to verify passenger documentation, and professional experience cannot justify ignoring medical emergencies. The sentencing phase brought international attention as advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and aviation industry representatives testified about the broader implications of the case. Their testimony emphasized that consequences needed to be severe enough to deter similar discrimination while promoting institutional changes throughout the transportation industry. This case represents an opportunity to send an unmistakable message that discrimination in transportation will not be tolerated. Testified Dr. Angela Davis, Director of the International Civil Rights Coalition. Appropriate sentences will demonstrate that prejudice carried deadly consequences when exercised through institutional authority. Judge O'Sullivan's final sentences reflected the gravity of crimes that had nearly cost a teenage life through prejudice and incompetence. Sandra received 4 years imprisonment for criminal negligence and civil rights violations, while Thompson received 6 years for aggravated assault and violation of federal regulations under color of authority. The sentences in this case must reflect not only the harm caused to Ms. Johnson, but the broader message about institutional accountability and civil rights protection, Judge O'Sullivan announced. When authority figures abuse their power through prejudice, society demands consequences that protect future victims. But criminal prosecution was only one aspect of accountability that followed from the incident. Civil litigation resulted in the largest aviation discrimination settlement in legal history, with Coastal Airlines paying $200 million to resolve claims that included not just compensation for Amara's injuries, but funding for institutional reforms throughout the industry. The settlement money was used to establish the Dignity in Transit Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to monitoring discrimination in transportation and providing legal support for victims of bias-based mistreatment. Amara, now 18 and recovered from her physical injuries, became the foundation's primary spokesperson and advocate. Last Christmas, they looked at my hoodie and saw a criminal, Amara said during the foundation's inaugural conference. They looked at my skin and saw a threat. They didn't check my ticket because they had already decided I didn't belong. Her voice was strong and clear, showing no trace of the trauma that had nearly ended her life. The months of recovery had transformed her from victim to advocate, someone who could speak about discrimination with the authority of someone who had survived its worst consequences. This foundation exists because my father had resources to pursue justice. She continued, but every passenger deserves protection from prejudice regardless of their family's wealth or status. We're here to ensure that dignity in transportation becomes a right, not a privilege. The Foundation's work extended beyond legal advocacy to include training programs for transportation workers, monitoring arrangements for identifying discrimination patterns, and rapid response protocols for assisting victims of bias-based mistreatment. The comprehensive approach reflected lessons learned from a case that had exposed institutional failures throughout the aviation industry. Captain Rodriguez, who had declared the medical emergency and ultimately saved Amara's life through decisive action, received commendation from international aviation safety organizations. His willingness to override crew prejudice with emergency medical protocols became required training material for pilots worldwide. Captain Rodriguez's actions demonstrate the importance of command authority in protecting passenger welfare. The International Pilots Association announced, "His decision to prioritize medical care over crew concerns exemplifies professional responsibility." But transformation extended beyond individual consequences to institutional changes that would protect future passengers from discrimination. New federal regulations required verification of passenger complaints through objective evidence rather than subjective assessments, while enhanced training programs addressed unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity for all airline personnel. The changes represented acknowledgement that Amara's case was not an isolated incident but part of broader patterns of discrimination that required institutional solutions rather than individual accountability alone. Justice had been served, but the real victory lay in organized changes that would prevent similar tragedies from occurring to others who lacked the resources to fight back against prejudice and abuse of authority. 1 year later, Christmas Eve found Amara Johnson walking through Dublin Airport as a changed person in a changed world. She wore a red business suit instead of a hoodie, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had survived the worst that prejudice could inflict and emerged stronger. But the most important change was not in her appearance. It was in the airport around her. New protocols were visible everywhere. Diversity training certificates displayed prominently at service counters, bias reporting arrangements accessible through QR codes posted throughout the terminal, and supervision procedures that required objective verification of all passenger disputes. The changes represented institutional acknowledgement that discrimination in transportation was a problem requiring comprehensive solutions. Amara's destination was London, where she would surprise her father with Christmas morning breakfast, completing the journey that had been interrupted so violently the previous year. But this trip was different in ways that extended far beyond improved airline policies and enhanced civil rights protections. She traveled as the founder and director of the Dignity in Transit Foundation, returning from a conference where transportation executives from across Europe had committed to implementing anti-discrimination protocols based on lessons learned from her case. The Foundation's work was transforming how the industry approached diversity inclusion and passenger rights on an international scale. At the departure gate, she encountered a familiar face from her traumatic journey, Dr. Rodriguez, who was traveling to London for a medical conference. Their reunion was warm and meaningful, representing the connection between someone who had suffered injustice and someone who had risked his own comfort to provide help when help was needed most. "How are you doing, really?" Dr. Rodriguez asked with the concern of someone who understood that healing from trauma was a gradual process that extended far beyond physical recovery. "I'm good," Amara replied honestly. "Not just surviving, but actually making a difference. The Foundation has helped more than 200 people file successful discrimination complaints this year. We've prevented other families from going through what mine experienced." Her answer reflected transformation from victim to advocate, someone who had channeled her traumatic experience into positive change that protected others from similar suffering. The conversation continued as they boarded, this time without incident discrimination or any suggestion that either passenger didn't belong in their assigned seats. As the aircraft lifted off from Dublin, Amara looked down at the tarmac where ambulances had waited exactly 1 year earlier and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The physical and emotional healing had been difficult, but the opportunity to create lasting change had given meaning to her suffering. Prejudice isn't just an insult. It's a weapon that can kill, she had told audiences around the world during the past year. But dignity isn't just a right. It's a force that can heal and transform institutions when people decide that justice matters more than comfort. The message had resonated with millions of people who shared her story, creating a movement for transportation equity that extended far beyond aviation to include all forms of public transit where discrimination could threaten passenger safety and dignity. As Christmas morning dawned over the Atlantic, Amara smiled, knowing that her father would be proud not just of her survival, but of her transformation from victim to advocate for others who needed protection from prejudice and abuse of authority. The crew of Flight 447 had learned too late that the girl in the Christmas hoodie carried more power in her dignity than they held in their authority. Their mistake had cost them everything, but it had given the world something invaluable proof that justice could prevail when people refused to accept that discrimination was inevitable. Her legacy was not just personal survival, but institutional change that would protect countless others from experiencing the trauma she had endured. That was the true meaning of Christmas morning. Not just celebration, but transformation that made the world more just for everyone. If you've witnessed discrimination in travel, your voice matters. Share this story, stand with victims, and remember that silence in the face of injustice makes us all complicit. Don't let another Amara suffer alone. Speak up when you see prejudice, demand accountability from airlines, and support organizations fighting for dignity in transportation. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Subscribe for more stories about justice and courage, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can ensure that every passenger flies with respect and dignity. Because sometimes the most important journeys aren't about reaching our destinations. They're about ensuring everyone has the right to travel safely, treated with the basic human dignity they deserve. Let me know in the comments below. Have you witnessed discrimination during travel? What would you have done in Dr. Rodriguez's position? Your stories matter, and together we can keep demanding better from the people and institutions that serve us all. Stay safe, travel with dignity, and never forget that change happens when good people refuse to stay silent. See you in the next one.